This map depicts the San Francisco metropolitan area that includes the counties of Contra Costa, San Mateo, Alameda, Marin, and San Francisco. Including these counties that are around San Francisco is essential because the public transportation in this area connects people to different counties and serves those who live outside of San Francisco. This map shows the number of people in the San Francisco County with a household income of less than $25,000 by census tract. The darker colored tracts on the map signify greater numbers of low-income individuals, which are clustered towards city centers. Most of these areas are in San Francisco and Oakland, Alameda. On this map, a layer that pinpoints the Bay Area rapid transit locations is added on top of the low-income map. As seen on this map, the darker colored areas that represent greater numbers of low-income individuals are also the same areas where BART stations are located. An inference to be made by this is that BART stations most likely serve concentrations of low-income individuals who live within the vicinity.
Before COVID-19, the economy of the San Francisco metropolitan area was relatively strong. About 95% of industry sectors were experiencing strong growth between 2009 and 2019, 45% of which were experiencing strong growth. That is, these industries were increasing in terms of their GDP outputs and number of jobs. In contrast, the mining sector was the only one to be in decline. During the pandemic, majority of industry sectors in San Francisco were still growing. 90% of industries were experiencing growth, 5% were in decline, 5% were on the cusp of strong growth and strong decline. Majority of these industries remained in the same quadrants they were in before the pandemic. However, many of the industries in the strong growth quadrant experienced reductions of the location quotients, but still continued to grow. Overall, the information and technological sectors contributed the most to the local economy. These sectors had a concentration of jobs that were more than double the national average and in high contributions to the GDP both before and during the pandemic. The 5 industry sectors that faced the greatest impact from the pandemic are as follows: the information industry, the arts and recreation industry, manufacturing, accommodation and food services, and then other services. However, these industries were not all impacted in the same way. For example, some industries, like the information and accommodation services, experience a greater change in their location quotients, which is the number of jobs, rather than their GDP outputs. Thus, the pandemic likely had a differential impact on each industry. While the PICS model looked at industry and GDP concentration in relation to the overall United States, it is imperative to look at these variables in relation to the exact number of jobs and GDP output lost or gained in the region. Here, each industry is listed in order of greatest change from the PICS analyses. The information industry was the only one to have grown in terms of number of jobs and GDP. Specifically, they gained a few thousand jobs and several millions in GDP output. The manufacturing industry increased in their GDP output, but not much in terms of their number of jobs. This is likely a result of the increased production towards PPE and medical equipment to address the needs of pandemics. The accommodations and arts industries saw dramatic reductions in terms of their number of jobs and GDP outputs. These industries are directly related to tourism, which is a key part of the area's economy. Due to the mandated restrictions on travel and social gatherings, the tourism industry severely underperformed in 2020. In turn, this likely resulted in the losses of tons of jobs and economic GDP output.
Overall, there was a decrease in public transit usage from 2019 to 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The largest decrease of public transit usage is within the management, business, science, and arts occupation by approximately 17,000 people. The next largest decrease in public transportation usage is within the service occupations, along with the sale and office occupations at a change of over 7,000 people. Almost all of the occupations listed experienced an increase in workers who worked from home. The most drastic change in the number of people who worked from home before the pandemic is within the management, business, science, and arts occupations, which is at a difference of approximately 90,000 people. Another notable difference to mention is the increase in the number of people who worked from home within the sales and office occupations by over 12,000 people. However, only about 7,000 people in that occupation stopped taking public transportation to work. An inferred Explanation of this discrepancy would be that people in this occupation use other forms of transportation that can include rideshare services, private transportation, and other forms of active transportation.
Before the pandemic, San Francisco had an expansive public transportation system. Although it was not perfect, routes were prevalent all throughout the city, and many affordable housing locations had direct access to numerous bus routes. However, the frequency and number of bus routes were greatly reduced due to the pandemic. In the city's decision-making process, they were guided by an equity process that focused on improving transportation performance in areas with high populations of low income and minorities. However, the city still altered 59 bus routes, and a majority of which were located downtown and in the surrounding neighborhoods. These are areas with high populations of low income and minority residents. As part of this strategy, the city aimed at ensuring that these populations would still be within a quarter-mile radius of a bus stop. Yet many of these affordable housing units lost direct access to the bus routes due to these reductions in service. While many affordable housing units were still in this quarter-mile radius, not all of them were. And those that were, their commutes to the bus stops likely increased. While the routes still existed in all parts of the city, many parts of the city, like in the Southwest, were left with only just a few routes, thus making accessibility in these neighborhoods more challenging for those low-income and minority populations. Overall, many of the routes that remained were along major transportation corridors, leaving out many of the smaller routes that once existed in 2019. Furthermore, all the routes that connected San Francisco County to Marion County were no longer in service. Consequently, these route changes had hindered transportation access to employment opportunities for many individuals.
All right, so the immediate consequence of the pandemic on public transportation was the impact on ridership. There was a steep decline in ridership and revenue that will take many years to recover. The San Francisco Transit Agency weekday transit exit graph shown here reveals that despite it being nearly 2 years since the city went into lockdown, the best month for transit ridership since then was still over 30% less than February 2020. And to be exact, it's more 34%. So what comes of this? The ridership decline has a negative impact on the economy in San Francisco as public transportation makes a profit from the excessive amounts of passengers who board transit each day. This means that when ridership numbers are low, revenue diminishes, which leads to budget cuts, which then leads to the loss of jobs in transportation, which leads to accessibility and equity concerns. The positive that can be taken from this is the congestion costs, which were decreasing as a result from the less traffic, as seen in this congestion graph. This congestion graph shows costs cut in half from 2019 and 2020 due to the pandemic. But that being said, the economic stability has not recovered since transit revenue is now plummeting. Now let's move on to the policy changes that occurred. The first and biggest policy change was the stay-at-home order. This lockdown policy was to keep non-essential workers inside their homes and to stop the spread of COVID. This policy change was an immediate consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic and had dire consequences on the transportation system in San Francisco. The order went into effect in the middle of March and stayed in place until May 25th in the same year, which was 2020. Another policy change would be the Slow Street program. This policy was a program designed to create safe transportation and to address equity concerns. The program limits traffic on some residential streets and increased walk and bike scores. Vision Zero was another policy that was implemented. This policy was implemented in February 2021. It was designed in order to create more street safety and increase the amount of bike lanes. The shifts in public transportation led to equity concerns rising throughout San Francisco. Some of the crucial equity concerns were accessibility issues, which accelerated once the protocols came into effect. One of the changes that led to inequity would be the accessibility of transit riders. When transit became accessible, less accessible, the more low-income residents suffered the most, as they are used to having public transportation, as they use it more than those of higher income. The lack of access to jobs, grocery stores, and necessary destinations reduced substantially. Those with disabilities also had trouble getting assistance with public transportation. This equity imbalance that had taken place had a detrimental impact on the economy when revenue began to plummet. When public transportation is deemed unreliable, people turn to alternative sources to get where they need to go. Ridership begins to decrease. When ridership numbers are down, the regional economy loses revenue. To ensure this does not continue to happen, prioritizing the creation of more equitable cities will bring in more money in more ways than just one. Planning for transportation has immense equity impacts that directly affect the regional economy. So being aware of these growing concerns can help the economy experience more growth and less failure.
Here you'll see what industries our survey respondents from San Francisco worked in. Prior to the pandemic, none of our respondents were working from home. However, you'll see a large shift where 83% of them during the pandemic did work from home, with only 17% of them not working from home. You'll see though, when asked if they're still working from home, that there is pretty much an even split between the three options, which is yes, they still work from home, no, they are not, or whether or not they're working in a hybrid situation. Our average commute time for individuals within San Francisco was between 20 to 30 minutes. It's also good to note that our survey respondents for San Francisco all used a personal vehicle to commute to work. Our interview subject for San Francisco worked as a physical therapist in an outpatient clinic. They expressed the issues that San Francisco had were specifically with their north to south transportation for both private vehicles as well as with public transportation routes. They also spoke about the Safe Streets program in San Francisco and how that impacted their commute negatively by increasing commuting times along what is called the Great Highway. Work-related precautions that were taken at this individual's workplace were standard with other healthcare facilities. However, they noted that as the pandemic has gone on, there has been many frustrations as the protections are still in place now that the pandemic sort of protocols have become either normalized or more workplaces are returning to pre-COVID standards.
We will now discuss some policy recommendations that we have for San Francisco in both the short term and the long term. With ridership numbers for SFMTA expected to take years to recover, these short-term policy recommendations are aimed to increase ridership in public transportation. This will provide an economic boost to lost revenue while cutting down on congestion costs, which San Francisco is expected to experience an uptick in the coming years. First, an increase in parking fees would help balance the lost revenue in transit fares, with the added bonus of incentivizing bus ridership. Expanding programs such as Drive and Ride, which allows people to drive and park at bus stops, would be another incentive for people to use public transportation without being entirely reliant on it. The SFMTA offers discounted rides to seniors and low-income individuals. To help alleviate congestion costs, we recommend expanding these discounts to the city's bike share program. The city has already increased the number of dedicated bike lanes in the city during the pandemic, providing a unique opportunity to promote biking to more people at a more affordable rate. The city's car share program, which allows low-income residents to access more places that are not connected via public transportation, should be expanded on. Being mindful that this is counterintuitive to cutting congestion costs, expanding this program should only be considered a temporary measure, and, if possible, providing electric vehicles for this service is recommended. One experimental measure the SFMTA can implement would be offering highly discounted fares for public transportation during high congestion events. San Francisco 49ers games are notoriously high congestion events within the city, and any measure that can be taken to decrease the number of cars on the road should be taken advantage of. Offering substantial discounts in public transportation fares during these events would incentivize their usage, especially among those who would not normally use the service. Our longer-term policy recommendations address deeper-rooted issues regarding equity and accessibility. During the pandemic, many of the workers who normally depended on public transportation to commute to work have transitioned to working from home or remotely. especially in the tech and information industry. While some firms intend on returning to an office environment, many intend on keeping a remote or hybrid working environment. This provides SFMTA an opportunity to assess changes in travel patterns and commuting demands and adjust the routes to accommodate these changes efficiently. In our analysis, we found that one of the most common complaints from residents regarding public transportation was the lack of communication from SFMTA regarding changes in bus routes and scheduling. Improving communications, including physical postings of changes at stops, would help residents and visitors better plan their trips and commutes and help alleviate issues of food insecurity that were experienced during the pandemic. We also recommend the city continue its Safe Streets program, as it allows more walkability within the city and is especially useful for those with disabilities. However, as we saw in our survey analysis, Safe Streets did contribute in increased congestion and commuting times for people with personal automobiles. We recommend the city closely monitor Safe Streets and perhaps adjusting its timing and placements to reduce congestion costs, while providing a useful system for those who use it.